Welcome to part 10, the last build video in the series of making a replica Kar-98. It's been a long process, making and modifying a whole bunch of parts to make the rifle look like it does now. The next step is to add finish to everything except for the bolt handle, which will stay in the white. For the other metal parts, like the rear sight, middle band, bayonet lug, and nose cap, I'll be rust bluing. The wood stock and handguard, I'll coat in boiled linseed oil. I'm going to start with them, since the oil will need at least a full week to cure. That will allow me enough time to blue the metal parts. I'll start with disassembling the rifle. The next time you see it together, it'll be complete. The stock, I left off with the wood being shaped, but not fully sanded. The surface is still a bit rough. It needs a final sanding. I'll start with 220 grit, then move to 320 grit, which will probably be sufficient. Since this is a military rifle, I don't want to make the wood too smooth, otherwise it just wouldn't feel right. .220 grit worked to further smooth out the curves of the stock. You can see that I used the sanding block on mostly flat surfaces, then freehand sanded the more complex curves, like the pistol grip area. Even at this stage, it feels smooth enough. However, I'll move up one more step to 320 grit, just to ensure everything is smooth without removing much more material. As I sand, I'm going to hold the stock above the workbench, not setting it down, which could create pressure marks on the edges of the buttstock and on the fore end. After a lot more sanding than shown, the stock is smooth, along with the handguard. At this point, I'm done with the workbench. Instead, I'll be hanging the stock like so. That's to avoid these marks, which are from the stock contacting the workbench. They come out with a bit of sanding. Of course, they're unavoidable later, but this way I can apply finish to the stock with its surface being consistent throughout. I had thought about staining the stock before adding the oil finish, but most pictures of Kar-98s online that I've seen have relatively light colored stocks. I took the piece cut off from the front of the stock and gave it a coat of oil without any stain. Though it's light, it will darken with age and handling. If I were to stain this, it would likely be too dark. This is only the first coat of oil. I'll be applying a few more light coats over the course of the next few weeks to build up a nice finish, but not one that's too glossy for a military rifle like this. I moved the stock out of the way so I can turn my attention to the middle parts. But before starting on bluing most of these, there's one small modification I need to make. That will be on the trigger guard here. Unfortunately, due to YouTube rules, I can't show the process. Instead, I'll cut to after it's done. Here's the reshaped trigger guard. The hole for the Gewehr 98 sling swivel has been removed. I then blended the curve at the front to match that at the rear. But now I'm left with a part that has finish missing from one area. The rest of the part has the finish that I want to target with all of the metal parts. A blued finish, but one that's worn and somewhat faded. I don't want a deep blue. That's an obvious sign that this rifle has been refinished. It will be refinished, but I don't want it to be obvious. For that reason, I'm only going to blue the parts that I need to. Others, like the barreled action, I'll leave as is. Even the areas that I've worked on, such as the front sight, has a decent enough finish left. I think that's from the heat of the torch used to solder it on. For this area where the rear sight used to be, it'll be covered up by the handguard. That leaves the rear sight. I'll remove the slider from the base. Now that those are separated, I'll separate the parts that won't be refinished from those that will. I'll take away the barreled action, floor plate, the butt plate, hit screws, the action screws, floor plate catch, sight pin, and cleaning rod. That leaves only the parts that will be refinished: the trigger guard, rear sight leaf, middle band, bayonet lug, nose cap, and their screws. Two of these, the rear sight and the trigger guard, mentioned earlier, have most of their original finish left. However, to add new finish and to make it blend in, I'll first remove what's here. To do so, I'll soak these in vinegar for around a half hour. Not all the finish has been removed, but what's left has faded enough that the new finish added on top will be consistent throughout and not too uneven. All I need to do is blend the two further by sanding the areas that were modified. I'll be using 320 grit sandpaper, which is all that I'll use. The bluing will need some surface to bite into, so I won't polish it any further. I sanded these parts much more than shown in the video. The nose cap probably has the biggest difference. The sides of it had some distinct mill marks, which are now gone. Despite the difference here, these parts aren't perfectly polished, which is fine since the bluing will need some texture to work properly, and most military rifle parts aren't fully polished like a fine sporting rifles would be. The next step is to fully degrease these parts. Bluing needs clean metal to work properly, both for the surface protection and the consistency of the finish. It wouldn't look very good if all this dirt and oil were left on the parts. From this point on, I'll keep all of the parts on clean towels and only handle them with gloves to prevent oily fingerprint marks. I'll start degreasing with brake cleaner. This will remove most of the surface contaminants, but just in case I'm going to do a few other rounds of degreasing. Acetone, 409, and then finally hot soapy water. These will remove anything that the brake cleaner won't, to ensure that the parts are as clean as possible. Once done degreasing, I'll heat the parts in a toaster oven on its lowest setting, around 200 degrees. This will evaporate any water, as well as heat the parts. I'll also bring a pot of clean water to a boil. To blue the metal, I'm using Markley Express Blue. It's a bit different from most rust bluing solutions, since it doesn't require a sweat box. The metal will rust after it's applied, as long as the surface is warmed. I'm pouring a small amount out in case I contaminate it. I won't ruin the whole bottle. To apply the solution, I'm using these cotton rounds, but I've seen others use cleaning patches. I'll remove the parts from the oven. And I'll start with the nose cap. I'll dip the patch into the solution and gently wipe it onto the metal. I've heard that the Express Blue is more forgiving than other rust bluing solutions. With those, you need to be very careful to avoid overlapping streaks. Here I'm more worried about making sure I touch every surface. This is the result of waiting about 10 minutes. A thin, light coat of rust. More of a discoloration if anything. But this is what I'm after. I'll add the parts to the boiling water and wait about 10 minutes for it to convert to bluing. I let the heat of the parts evaporate any remaining water. The metal is covered in a thin layer of loose rust, called velvet. and it doesn't look very even, but the finish will be built up in several light coats. Next, I'll use the carding wheel to remove the velvet. When degreasing the parts, I also degreased the carding wheel to make sure it didn't have any oil in it. Then I'll repeat the process from the beginning until I achieve the desired look. These are the parts after 6 rounds of bluing. The finish isn't perfect, but I don't want to chase perfection. These are good enough. A perfectly even and deep blue-black finish just wouldn't look right on this rifle. You can see that I added the floor plate during the bluing process. With the trigger guard being blued, I wanted this part to better match. To set the bluing, I'll add oil to the parts. This is non-detergent oil. It doesn't have any cleaners in it like motor oil does. I'll coat the parts and let them soak it up. I wiped away the excess oil. The finish on the metal is more brown in color than blue. I'm sure if I were to keep adding coats, it would even out and turn more black. But I think this is the right time to stop for the look that I want. One thing that I don't like is this stripe in the middle band where the filler material is welded in. It shows that different steels can have different reactions to the bluing solution. But I don't think there's any way around this other than adding more coats. But this is less noticeable than it was after the first couple of coats. And now with all of these parts blued, I can begin to reassemble the barreled action. I'll start with the rear sight. I'll continue on with the trigger guard and the floor plate catch. Then I'll add the floor plate and the spring and follower. Now with the barreled action assembled, here's the stock. I added about 5 coats of boiled linseed oil. The stock turned out both darker and more interesting than I thought. There's areas of darker wood, like on the underside of the butt, and this dark line running down the length of the side here. The handguard is lighter, but there's not too drastic of a difference. I'll add on the metal parts, starting with the butt plate. Next, I'll join the barreled action to the stock. Last, I'll add on the front end metal parts. Now with the rifle reassembled, you may have noticed something. Yes, I'm deliberately refraining from showing the whole rifle. Unfortunately, you'll have to wait until the next part in this series to see the completed Kar98, as well as hear my thoughts about this rifle and the process of recreating it. Until then, thanks for watching.